So on Friday we had this, it was a small funeral in the day chapel, and this guy died named Jim Cox. And his son got up and gave a eulogy. And the eulogy was actually pretty good. And he said to, there's 11 grandchildren, so he said, this is your inheritance. Your inheritance is your grandfather gave you an example of a great life. He loved his wife. He loved his family. He spent his life serving other people as a coach and a teacher. He was a football coach. He taught his children always to stand up to bullies, to defend the weak. And he said, that is your legacy. And he urged the grandchildren, he says, live up to your grandfather's legacy. And I just love that he did a great job as a eulogy. And the grandfather, Jim, said they never heard him complain about anything. And I thought, my goodness, a twin of mine. I complain a lot. I can't imagine never going through life and people saying, we never heard him complain. But what I really loved is that idea that is your inheritance. That's your example. Don't let us down. And I like that because at Irish funerals, there's this custom that after the funeral, you hold up a glass and you thank God for what you inherited from your parents. And if you're Irish, it's never money or the ability to tan up. But what you inherit is an example. And be true to that example. And I love that image of holding up a glass. And just for me personally, like the Eucharist, that reminds me of the Eucharist. When you hold up the chalice, we're thanking God for what we inherited. And we'll be true to that example. That's what people are supposed to inherit. And a good example, it does change people's life. If it's done very well and they honor it, it's amazing how it can change things. Even some years ago, the ISIS got 20 Coptic Christians, which is basically Ethiopian Catholics. They captured them. And I don't know if you remember this, it was in the news. They dressed them up in orange jumpsuits and took them to the water and beheaded them. But before they beheaded them, they asked them to renounce Christ, and none of them did. And so all 20 were beheaded. But there's another guy there who obviously wasn't Christian, and he was so moved at their conviction and courage, he said, that is my God. Whatever God they worship, that is the God I wish to worship. So they executed him as well. But the only point being is that it only shows a great example can really encourage people to do outstanding acts of bravery. And I mention that because that's what's going on in the readings today. That in the first reading, Maccabees, they give such a great example that it changes the nation. What happened about 200 years before Christ came in Israel, the Greeks came in and conquered Israel. And they wanted to destroy Judaism. So they basically tortured or threatened to kill anybody who was caught practicing the faith. And so it picks up today's story where it has this mother and her children, the mother and 7 brothers. And all of them refused to renounce their faith. And so each one is murdered in public. And each one gives a little speech. And the 7th brother, before he dies, he says to the people, our deaths are to be an example for you. Our death is a prayer that you will learn that you don't have to live in fear. If you believe in the resurrection, why would you fear? Why would you cave in to coercion and fear? Why would you give up your faith for a little bit of gold? Stand up. And they make such a great example. It actually works. And the people overthrow the Greeks, and they're set free. A great example has huge effects. And I love that idea that this is what we've inherited. As Catholics, we come from over 2,000 years of people who believe in the resurrection. And if you believe in the resurrection, I love this connection, that it should have this courageous life. You live your life poured out in love for other people, in service for God and other people, and you're not a coward. Why be afraid of death? What can they do to you? Threaten you with resurrection? Why not live courageously and pour out your life for others? And so that's kind of the same thing, that we hold up an example that we want to be true to. But this odd thing happens at the gospel. The Sadducees, they're the descendants of the ruling class that kicked out the Greeks. The Maccabees, they believed in the resurrection. They believed in handing on an example. 200 years later, when you get to the Sadducees, they're a little bit different. Even though they're the descendants, the Romans come in, and the Romans say to the Sadducees, the ruling party, we'll give you gold if you capitulate. And they're like, give it. So the Sadducees' theological position is, we're religious, but we'll take the money. But of course, the Sadducees, because if you believe in the resurrection and you've poured out your life in love and service and courage, then in the resurrection, you have nothing to fear. So the Sadducees, unlike their ancestors, gave up the theology that the Messiah would bring about the resurrection. Instead, they said, no, we'll take all the gold we can. And so the seven brothers that gave the example, 200 years later, you see the Sadducees rejecting all that. And they come up with this example for Christ, once again about seven brothers. They said, well, there's no such thing as a resurrection. Imagine if you had seven brothers, and all of them marry the same woman but die, so the next one marry. At the resurrection, who's the woman married to? And Jesus, whenever you have questions about the afterlife, he doesn't really answer them. All he really says is that the afterlife does not work like here on earth. It's not just a continuation of earth. Heaven is at the very source of intimacy and love. And if you've lived your life in relationship with others and love, you'll get what heaven is like. If you've lived your life very selfishly, taking care of yourself, you're not going to get what heaven is about. It drives me up the wall when people's image of the afterlife is just a continuation of earth. And I've been to funerals where you get these eulogies where somebody will stand up and say, my grandfather loved golf, and so I'm sure in heaven he's in the best golf course ever. And at that point, I try not to sigh and roll my eyes in disgust. But I do find that absolutely disgusting, that somehow heaven is just a big Disneyland. Heaven is the very source of love and life, and if you lived your life like that, you'll get what it's about. And so Christ basically says that's a silly example. That's not what the resurrection is. And what I like is that we've inherited this 2,000-year-old custom, not custom, 2,000-year-old example of martyrs that gave their lives for the faith, of men and women who poured out their lives as an example. That's what our children are going to inherit. And I have to say I like that because my grandfather gave this speech to his children. He was one of my grandfathers was a rancher, very easygoing, happy guy, had a little bit of money. And he told his kids, he said, your mother and I have already given you your inheritance. When I die, do not expect to get any money from me. I gave you an example of love. I gave you an example of a great marriage. I gave you faith. I gave you an education. If you can't make it in the United States, after all what I've given you, you're not living off my money. And they were quite happy with that. They had no problem with that. They believed they received a great inheritance. And I hope for our children that their parents and their grandchildren give them a great inheritance of a life poured out in love. I mean, we literally act that out every Mass. The gifts are placed on the altar. It's our lives that are being offered at the altar where we pour out our lives in love and courage. We will not capitulate to fear or think you can call yourself religious and spend your life grasping for everything you can. What we want is to give our children an example that really, if you believe in the resurrection, why not spend your life poured out in love and service for other people? I mean, hopefully all our children can be like the son John, who gets up and says, be true to the example, be true to your legacy that your grandparents gave you. That's what we inherited from the apostles.